I have to say this for data protection purposes, and also because Meredith, who has done so much work to get this event in place, will kill me if I don't do so. Okay, Mevan.
Hello, I'm Mevan. I work at the Google News Initiative, and I'm very proud today to be supporting this product and this tool to be out into the world, which I believe is like live as of 4 p.m. today.
As of 4 p.m.
Yeah. I want to tell you a little bit about the Google News Initiative and also why I think this is so important. At the Google News Initiative, we support the news ecosystem by training journalists, by also building tools to support journalists and fact checkers around the world. And that's my job, is to support fact checking specifically because I come from the world of fact checking. I was actually at Full Fact, the UK's independent fact checking charity, for 7 years. And helped build that from the ground up, and also ended up being part of a coalition of 300 fact checkers around the world. And when we were fact checking during various conflicts or during a pandemic or whatever it was, there were two things that were always incredibly important in terms of infrastructure. One was access to expertise, and one was sources, and actually making sure that you had primary sources available. And when it came to conflicts, both of those things were incredibly hard to access, as you probably all know better than I do. Getting real-time information during a conflict is incredibly difficult, and making sure that it's trusted all the way down to it is very, very hard. Making sure it's up to date is very, very difficult, and the context is changing all the time. So having something like this, which starts to actually make that evidence and that expertise much more widely available, is incredibly valuable to the helpers, the people who are trying to do the counting, the people who are trying to collect the evidence. And to actually make that expertise more accessible to people makes the downstream effects much more strong. And when I say downstream effects, I mean not just collecting that evidence, but then also making sure that goes to international criminal courts or whatever it is further down the line, but also potentially downstream effects in terms of showing people where the numbers come from. We live in a world where people don't really trust numbers so much anymore. And actually, it's really important that we can show them that the numbers come from here, the evidence comes from here, this is how we know this evidence, this is the chain of trust that has led this piece of evidence to come to you. And I think chains of trust is the thing that this helps actually put out more into the world, and actually making that more accessible. So I'm really proud to be here today to help support it. And just speaking personally, I was a refugee for 5 years as a result of the war in Iraq when I was very young. And there was a chemical attack on a town next to mine called Halabja. And the facts of that are still being disputed to this day. And we still technically don't know exactly what it was that landed on those 5,000 people. And I think being able to, in the moment, have access to that expertise and those sources means that also we tell the stories of those people in the long run in the best possible way.
Okay, well, I guess Julia?
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, so very brief thank yous, obviously, to Jack and Kings for hosting us, to Aries for being great partners on this, to Mevan for making it happen, also to the Reva and David Logan Foundation, who are long-time supporters and brilliant funders of Airwars' non-profit work. I wanted to talk a little bit about where this idea came from and the problem we were trying to solve, and I think some of that's been mentioned already. I worked as a journalist for a decade in the Middle East. My last job was as the chief correspondent for the West Bank and Gaza with AFP, which is a big news agency. Obviously, yeah. And during that time, myself and other journalists, I would say, and I think most journalists in the room will understand what I mean when I say we had a just enough policy, where not a policy, but where we knew just enough about munitions to not sound stupid, but not enough to actually feel like we knew anything. And so we knew the difference between artillery and tank fire, but we also didn't really. And you know, we knew if somebody said, "Oh, that's artillery," we could say, "Oh, maybe it's tank fire." But no one, you know, and in terms of trying to understand munitions, there really wasn't any resources that was, you know, enabled you to go from knowing a little bit to knowing a bit more and feeling a bit more confident. And then I joined Airwars, and so Airwars is the world's leading kind of open source civilian harm monitor, and we document civilian harm in multiple contexts: Somalia, Yemen, Iraq, Syria, Libya, Ukraine, and now Gaza and Israel. And we use open source methodologies to do that primarily, and it's, you know, an established thing. I set up the investigations unit a couple of years ago, and the investigations unit is slightly different in the sense of we're going really deep into a particular incident, which I think, you know, looking at you, many of you in this room do very similar. And the first thing I would do with any incident in which explosive weapons led to the deaths of civilians is I would find all of the evidence that I could of essentially the remnants, the shrapnel, the fragments, whatever language you want to use, and then I would send it to a munitions expert. And over time, I came to realize that it was both kind of undemocratic and inefficient. And it was inefficient because, you know, on a very basic level, I was having to contact them. They would send it, it would take a day, but sometimes they'd come back and say, well, that's just bits of metal. I can't do anything with that. And sometimes they come back and say, well, obviously that's a piece of artillery. Why do you know, like, that's fairly clear. And there was nothing in between those stages to enable us to understand. And it was undemocratic because, frankly, I know 5 or 6 munitions experts who are willing to help me because, you know, of my job at Airwars, you know, but like most people don't have that access, and most people breaking into journalism or you know, or the armed conflict specialists just don't have those networks. And so that gap in between knowing nothing at all and being a real specialist, there is nothing there in that gap. And so that was what we kind of were trying to fill in. And so my team and I, and then particularly I would highlight Imogen, who's here in the room, is now with the Washpo, and Clive, who's not with us, and Sanjana. We kind of brainstormed this idea and came up with the idea of a munitions portal where everything would be done visually. So I have a photo of a thing, I have a photo of what may be a munition, and then I match it to whatever else I can see, whatever else I can see on the portal. And gradually that kind of came about as an idea. And then I called Nick, who is the head of Ares, who unfortunately couldn't be here. And actually it was like we were having the same conversation or the same idea from the other end of the telescope, whereas Nick, they train hundreds or thousands of, Charles, you can give us more, of journalists and NGO workers and people every year on munitions. And at the end of the course, they always say the same thing. Oh, what resources are there further? What can I look at beyond this? And there's not really, and they're not like, there's like the brilliant work, the ARCs is a brilliant thing, but it's aimed at a technical audience. There's nothing with that accessibility. And I also thought the other kind of, Julia and I would quite regularly say to ourselves through the process, like, this can't be weapons porn, right? And this has to be about recognizing the civilian harm or the impact of these. This is not just about, you know, this cool, you know, there's a lot of stuff in parts of the internet about, wow, this amazing weapon can do this and this and this, without any recognition of the actual impact as well. So those were kind of the things that were kind of driving us. And we came to this idea. And then, as I said, the GNI offered to support it, and as did our long-term funders, the Logan Foundation. And then I kind of realized I had no idea how to go from there to what we have today. And so luckily we found Julia.
Thank you, Joe. And thanks to Kings for hosting and everyone in the panel and the audience. In journalism, images are no longer an attachment that illustrates a story, but they are actually the material through which a story can be told. And that was a bit the driving force to creating a tool that allows journalists and researchers to investigate conflicts through the images that are produced in conflict. And we wanted, as Joe was explaining, to create a tool that could bridge the gap that there is between a specialized technical field and a wider community researching and reporting on conflict. So there are already existing tools in this field, like, for example, CatUXO, which is a referent to us, and which offers a great detailed information and identification about munitions. But we realized that these tools were maybe designed with a technical and specialist munitions audience in mind, rather than a generalist one. And so they exhibit munitions in an ideal state, and we realized that that's not the actual state where munitions are found on the ground. So we wanted to build a tool that could democratize specialized knowledge, founded on two main principles: organizing and classifying munitions through a visual register, and making language accessible. So making this technique field accessible to anyone that is interested in it, and especially researchers and journalists. So our tool departs from the visible characteristics of munitions as they are found on the battlefield. And to this end, we created a set of taxonomies that would allow us to identify these different visual characteristics. And to this, I must thank Aris for all of their guidance and all of the work they've put into also helping us translate this technical vocabulary into a visual vocabulary, and one that can be worked through the image. And also to Clive Bella, who was behind designing the database in Airwars, and to Rectangle, who are designers and web developers that have helped us and make this come true as well, and that also like have this visual understanding in order to do the translations that we needed on munitions. And then it was through this translation of the visual register that we also started developing a series of animations with Azrul de Monte, who is a visual researcher in the investigations unit, that could put this language into an accessible domain. And this is a short example of how an animation works. I don't know if...
Thanks, Google.
The driving band, the propellant charge and primer. They are typically fired from artillery guns, heavy indirect fire weapons that require high structural strength to withstand the pressure of firing. The projectile and the cartridge are loaded from the gun's breech. A firing mechanism ignites the propellant charge, which accelerates the projectile through the barrel. Rifling. A pattern of grooves inside the barrel imparts spin to the projectile, allowing it to fly towards the target with relative accuracy. Range munition. A typical 155mm artillery projectile has a lethal radius ranging between 50 and 150 meters.
But going back to the main archive, which is the landing page of the portal as well, as I was saying, we organized the database through these visual characteristics and grouped them into different taxonomies. So for example, you can maybe choose some options so we can show how different filters operate. Maybe, so you will have a main, the main categories, the main 4 categories of munitions, and then which are artillery, air-delivered bombs, mortars, and rockets or missiles, and then a set of characteristics of how might be the state that you find them on ground, what are their characteristics, for example, on fins, what is their shape, what are some of the mechanical features that are visible. And through these different characteristics, the repository of images is filtered, and you can then compare one image to another, because we thought that that was also a very important feature, was the fact that you could be comparing images and learn through that comparison. So yes, maybe also you can enter to an individual image.
There it is.
Yes, so yeah, if you can minimize the,
Yeah.
yes. Yes, so then for each individual image, we would expand the information also on the location and on the date it was found. And we would also connect the images where it was possible to the Airwars archive. So as Joe was explaining, Airwars has the most extensive archive on civilian casualties that there is, especially in Syria and Iraq. So we wanted to bring this archive as well into the tool, and also bring the qualitative dimension and the human dimension to this tool, right? Because these are not only munitions that are found on the ground, but they're munitions that are the cause of death of many people. So we wanted to highlight that and bring that into the tool as well. And then also, as one clicks into a particular image, you can then just kind of go through all other images that have the same tags to, as I was saying, be able to compare these different images with similar characteristics. So we understood this archive as a first step in order to classify munitions, but then we, as Joe was saying, we were thinking about the journalists and the researchers that come with an image, and then how can that image be classified? So then we created this second tool, which allows to upload a file, an image that might be found on the ground, and then go through a questionnaire that can help to identify what kind of munition we're talking about. So maybe here you would first try to look at any identifiable parts in the shape. So then maybe choose the more similar one, and then see if there are any themes. And it's also important, what we're saying about making language accessible is not only about saying things in a simple manner, but also in this visual manner. So any terms that were technical terms to us, and for me especially, a lot of them were technical because I don't have a background in munitions at all. These tooltips that we created were a way to explain further these terms, and I must say they have been very effective because I can now tell much about munitions. And yes, so then we would identify if there's any cylindrical, separated cylindrical assembly. So at the same time, as one is going through this questionnaire and identifying these different characteristics, the archive next to it is changing. So you again can compare your image to any images that might have similar characteristics. So you can get to a conclusion on what is the classification of the munition. I think that would make it for the explanation, walk around a bit of the tool, and maybe back to Joe to enlighten us of the future of the tool.
So, I mean, one of the things that, like, first of all, is it's really, I don't know if I can be heard, but like, it's really great to have a bit of an OSINT community here, because it's felt in recent years, I'm looking at you, Bellingcat, everyone's going to Europe since Brexit. It's been very, so like, it's really nice. And like, one of the reasons we wanted to get people here is that we understand that this is a first version of this tool, and we've worked it out, and this is kind of, we're now putting it out into the world. And now we kind of want you guys and other people and feedback. And we've, and actually, sorry, I forgot at the beginning, I should thank a few people who did really in-depth feedback. Brian Perlman, Mark Galasco, Christiaan himself, Chris Cobb-Smith, Desmond Travers, and Ian Byrne. Sorry, I just forgot to do that at the beginning. But those, like, really now what we're interested in, so we want to develop this tool is, obviously, we know there's big gaps, you know, there's areas that we can grow. And I think, like, one of the things that immediately we're going to work on, and this is a conversation with that we're working on with Airwars, and this is what we don't currently have because Airwars are just in the process of confirming them, but like this will be a tentative model as well. So you'll be able to see the tentative model, and that's not for every image, but where possible, you'll have a tentative model, and then you'll be able to click through on that, and that will take you to X number of pictures of that that are available in the archive, all the pictures of in the archive of that model. And hopefully once that's the next immediate stage, is like having a brief text explaining it, etc., explaining what, who uses the 9M27, etc., etc. So that's the next stage. But then there's also, I mean, we're talking very specifically about making it available in other languages. I think primarily Arabic and Ukrainian, so that it can be, I mean, this is 90% of the images in this are from Ukraine, because that's the period that we were working on it over the past year. But we obviously, what you've seen in Gaza, and Christiaan could talk a bit more about that, but like in Gaza, there's been so much misidentification of munitions and frags, and basically it's all just Mark Velasco on Twitter telling us what it is or whatever, right? There's not, there's a lot of misidentification, a lot of stuff, of allegations of, oh, this is an American missile, or this is white phosphorus, etc. And so that trying to build that evidence base of like is where we want to get to. And yeah, so this is really kind of proof of concept. We're looking at new conflicts, new languages. And then I think longer term, I think what we would like to do is work out a way that it's more of a community approach. Obviously, this is right now, this is us and Ares putting this out into the world. What I think would make sense over time is that like we work out a way that like other people can give feedback, and people like either on specific munitions, or that we pool our knowledge, really is the premise of this whole thing. And so that kind of is where I will leave it, I think.
Okay. Charles?
Hi, guys. I quickly, before I get into everything, I just want to thank the Air Wars team again for their excellent work on this project, and also to quickly thank the members of Ares that couldn't be here today. So our director and our Jensen Jones, research coordinator Patrick Senft, associate researcher Mick F, and technical specialist Tony Salvo. Everyone there was just as, if not more, important to this project than I was. So thanks, everyone, if you guys are watching. So I'm Charles Randall. I'm an associate researcher at Ares, or Armament Research Services. We are a technical intelligence consultancy that specializes in arms and munitions research and analysis in conflict zones around the world. And so today I'm going to be telling sort of briefly about our role in the project. I think Joe and Julia covered very, very nicely sort of the purpose of the project and why it's very important. So I'll just sort of get into a little bit onto our role and how we added some value and what that can tell you guys about why the project, or how you can use the project in the future. So we basically had three main roles, which were mostly on the back end rather than sort of their, the excellent website they've put together. We first we sort of tried to find a way for a non-specialist to classify munitions in a meaningful way, so way they would understand, and also, but also that one that remains accurate. Then we also collected something like, I don't know, Joe can probably fact check me, or something like 350 images of munitions, mostly from Ukraine, that we then tagged according to their physical features. And then lastly, we provided a list of definitions and glossary entries that we hope will make the tool more accessible, more democratic, and just overall more effective. So I'll talk briefly about each of these a little bit more. So our primary role was developing the classification methodology, which was influenced heavily by ARCS, which Joe briefly mentioned, the Ares Arms and Munitions Classification System, which is our proprietary system for defining and classifying munitions. So basically, from there, we sort of zeroed in on the four classes of munitions that Joe and Julia just showed. So air-delivered bombs, rockets and missiles, artillery gun projectiles, and mortar projectiles. And the reason that we chose these, and that we think they'll have use for you as the four sort of main classification groups, is because they're very easy to distinguish from one another by physical characteristics. They're, as you know, the silhouettes as were shown are all fairly distinct. And so and using those physical characteristics and building a questionnaire around those, we were able to sort of come up with a way that just sort of through, answering yes and no to a few questions, a classification could be achieved as, fairly quickly. And the important thing in this was that, again, all of these sort of features, or as we called them, and as they're sort of on the website as tags, were supposed to be sort of binary. So either you have them or you don't. And they, again, really trying to make sure that, if we said a munition had fins, that everyone would be able to tell that a munition had fins, with all the sort of definitional and visual stuff that is on the website. And sort of throughout this process of trying to come up with that classification tool, we spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to order the questions that were shown. So like, I spent a lot of time personally on working on flowcharts and trying to come up with stuff that wasn't super complex. And what we ended up sort of deciding on was starting with the silhouette or shape, because they're all fairly distinct from one another, as you guys can see, and then going to like a few important key characteristics on top of that. So you know, like welding seams for a air-to-air bomb, or the long fins attached to a perforated cylindrical assembly for mortar projectiles. Stuff that if you know what you're looking for, like there, which that image is really, really helpful. And you know that there's fins, that it's shaped like that, and that it has perforated cylindrical assembly. You can be pretty sure that it's a mortar projectile. And our sort of the base assumption you're working with is that most of you guys who come to the portal are going to come, if you come with an image, going to come with something that hopefully will be fairly easy to classify once you know what you're looking for. And so going through those sort of just a few questions should, I think, come up with a classification fairly quickly. Whereas, you know, as Joe mentioned, sometimes you just come up with you know, metal fragments, and those might be more, you know, talk to a munition specialist directly. But, you know, for most cases, it's going to be, and everything on the website, which is 500 images, 600 images. 500. You can tell pretty clearly what it is, and we're able to classify them. So that was our main role in the project, is coming up with that sort of flow chart design. But then also we contributed to the other parts of the website as well, and I'll just talk quickly about these. So the other really important thing that we did is we collected all of or we did not collect all of them. We collected a lot of the images that are now on the portal, and sort of tagged them according to their physical features. And again, we had to sort of do this because from our background of technical specialists, we, you know, might be able to tell if some, like a little fragment away from the rest of the munition is a fin or not. But knowing in a sense that people who come to it might not know the difference between a fin and just another scrap of metal, we made sure to tag all the images in a way that would be immediately obvious to everyone who knows, you know, what a fin is, as was shown on the website. And so trying to sort of tag all the things in a way that was both accessible and also accurate, so that you guys get you know, better information, but information that isn't just a 500-page book dumped on your head. And then the last thing we did, which is similar in that vein, was we worked on the glossary that's on the website, and sort of the definitions that accompany the images, little pop-up things. And the glossary is based a lot on ARC's and the Ares glossary that's already sort of out there. But we did try to, as Joe said, that's, you know, more designed for technical specialists. So we really tried to alter slightly the definitions for user friendliness and for the specificity within the portal itself. And I think that sort of balance that we've been trying to strike the whole time between sort of this like very technical, accurate information, and also that accessibility and democratizing of the information around that, I think it was definitely the sort of the biggest challenge we faced, at least on our end. But I think it's turned out really nicely, and I'm really happy with how sort of the push and pull went with Ares and Airwars, and trying to sort of, you know, us from the more technical side and them from the more user facing side. I'm really happy with how it's turned out. Yeah, and so I think I'm just to conclude, I want to say, you know, how valuable we think this is going to be for journalists, for academics, for IGOs and NGOs, for arms researchers, really anyone with any munition related question. We think it's going to be really, really valuable, and we hope to see it get put to good use and hopefully expanded on in the future. Thanks, guys.
Christiaan, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, first of all. And it's a great panel. I mean, Jack mentioned it. 8 years ago, I was studying at King's College, actually. So I used to be one of Jack's students. So it's a great panel to be a part of. Charles, thank you for for the info you just gave. And ours is obviously doing great work. Mevan working on so many great projects at Google. Joe, of course, running Airwars right now in a great way. And Julia, congratulations with your new job at Forensic Architecture as well. Yeah, I want to keep it short, but I think it's really exciting to see this tool being launched. As I said, 8 years ago in the Mohun Library of King's College London and other parts of King's College London. I'm not sure where exactly you're all sitting, maybe on the fancy new Strand campus. But I started doing open source investigative work, right? I was a master's student, and in my free time and as part of my studies, I would like look at munitions and try to identify them and try to investigate, hey, can I figure out who's responsible for an airstrike in, let's say, Syria? Is it the Air Force of the country I'm from, the Netherlands, which was not necessarily providing that much info? Was the Russian airstrike, and so on? And I literally just started putting my findings on Twitter, and that's how I got involved with. I got contacted by an Amnesty International research, like, hey, how did you find out more info about this airstrike? I'm like, well, just look at some footage online, you know. And that's how I got involved with Bellingcat, that had just started, as well as Air Wars. And both was as a volunteer, right? And I think this open source investigative, or sometimes the word OSINT being used, right, has grown hugely. And I think there's a lot of accounts right now on Twitter that call themselves OSINT Defender, all kinds of stuff. And there's a lot of misinformation and disinformation there now too, unfortunately. But the community has grown significantly, and I think that's also a very exciting thing to see, right? There are a lot of people that have a lot of eyes on things that happen around the world, and I think that can be something good for the kind of accountability that whether it's Air Wars, or whether it's a visual investigations unit at the New York Times, or whether it's, you know, forensic architecture, whether it's the Washington Post. There's so many groups that are trying to find out, okay, what happened, right? And I think exactly what Joe was saying in the beginning, I right now have access, because I work for the New York Times. I can call up someone like Mark Alasko. I can email Aris and say, hey, we really need some help with identifying this piece of munition that we found, or that a source sent us, right? But indeed, many of the munitions are relatively easily identifiable if you know where to look, right? And I think this portal will make it so much easier for this huge community that's out there right now to just do some quick first steps, and as Charles said, in most instances able to classify, hey, what am I looking at, you know, or at least have an indication of what I'm looking at. And I think that's just hugely, it's actually very, very great to see that. And thank you all for making it. I said it in an email when we were providing some feedback, and there was some feedback rounds on the tool, but I was like, thank you for doing this for everyone that's already in this community, but also anyone that may start as well, right? Or is just like as Julia said, like, oh, I don't necessarily, you know all these terms. I don't know all these terms either, right? And I think even for me, when I'm trying to describe something, and people don't necessarily trust image, okay, well, why would I believe this and stuff like that? If I understand better as well what I'm actually describing, and I have a readily available database with descriptions like, hey, actually, this is the perforated, someone needs to help me here. And of the mortar, you know, like it is very, very helpful. And I think I just want to conclude by saying once again, like, thank you for building this tool.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Christiaan. Just before we open it up to questions, to what has been a really great panel and a really great introduction to an important tool, as a reflection for myself as an academic, a long time ago, in the late 2000s, early 2010s, I did a PhD on American targeted killings. And I had an entire chapter of my PhD that was basically devoted to what can we actually know about what's going on in places like Afghanistan and Pakistan. which is basically dedicated to kind of comparing some of the early data sets that are a bit maybe being made available about US drone strikes. And it's quite fantastic to see the development of tools like this, because I really wish I'd had stuff like this and kind of community of practitioners basically around in those days, because it would have made my PhD a lot easier. But also it's great to see the way in which Airwars has developed, kind of like from its founding. You know, like through my PhD, I met Chris Woods, who's the founding director of Airwars. And one of the key things I think about Airwars itself is it's also an archive of past knowledge about these kind of conflicts. Many of the data sets that I looked at for my PhD, you can't actually access them anymore because the websites are gone. Whereas the Bureau of Investigative Journalism's data has been incorporated in Airwars' own archives. So yeah, it looks like an amazing tool for use. I think personally speaking, I think open source investigation of conflict is like a huge area that's very interesting to me as an academic. It's also of great interest to our Center for Science and Security Studies. We do a lot of open source investigation on things like sanctions compliance and arms control, which is slightly different from the kind of stuff we're doing there, but I think thematically and intellectually in the same kind of area. So I'll open it up for questions now. I believe we have about 20 to 25 minutes for questions. I'd ask you to identify yourselves before asking a question, and also just as a reminder, this event is being recorded right now.
And one of my going around. So
We have a microphone, yes. Okay, great. So, questions?
Josh Baker, BBC.
Hang on, I gotta use them.
Yeah.
You gotta wait for the mic.
everybody
The internet needs to hear you.
It's a really great tool. Thanks, guys. My name's Josh Baker, work with the BBC. Just a very simple question. What's the scale of the database on munitions released in Syria, Northwest Syria, things like that? Is it being built up? How big is it now?
Yeah, so relatively small. There are 500 images in total. So, you know, this is a project. So this is, it was always a kind of, I never know if it's beta or beta project. One of those things, alpha, beta, that one. Yeah, so this was to see it so it's 500 images, of which the primary focus was Ukraine, because that was, this was done throughout past year, and that's, and so most of the munitions in there are from Ukraine. I'd say probably around 85%.
Yeah, like 350.
Yeah, maybe. So there's around 100-ish from other conflicts. So that includes Syria, that includes Gaza, that historical Gaza, that includes Yemen. We haven't. So obviously it takes the. Oh, it might not be.
No, you are.
The important thing is that, I think. So we were discussing whether we should try and, for the launch, have some Gaza images in there, and it's from the horrific scenes that are happening right now. And Christiaan, we talked last week about there was a artillery round that was found in a hospital and that was misidentified, etc. And would this have been identifiable in 2 seconds, right? But we also, the importance of this tool is that that every image has been through Ares, right? And that every image has been essentially checked by somebody that knows this stuff, right? And so yeah, Northwest Syria, Northeast Syria are priorities, like in the next iteration, I think. And yeah, I think.
So with that, I mean, with those of us who work in those environments and regularly see the sort of munitions or remnants of war, do you want submissions? Do you want help with that? Is there a mechanism for doing that?
You think so? You designed it.
Yeah.
And then I'll stop talking. So.
Yes, actually there is a mechanism for that. Whenever you upload any image in the classification tool, you've got the option to upload that to our archive. And that doesn't mean that it will directly be published in the main archive. It will then pass on to an archive that is waiting to be verified, because basically designing this pipeline of verification has been like one of the most important tools or most important points of the project. And now that we've got the pipeline design, the more images that we can have, then we can put through that pipeline. So yes, in case that there were any researchers coming up with an image, they can upload it to an archive that then will be verified.
Thank you.
And just to add on that specifically, if there are organizations watching that have big archives that they want to talk about putting into the tool, we're really keen. I think the big areas that we don't currently cover are submunitions, so cluster munitions, and mines. And I think Nick and I have had a conversation about, and maybe you want to talk a little bit about that, Charles, but like, those are big gaps in what we know is in the tool. And yeah, so those are kind of obvious next steps.
Yeah, I mean, if people want to know, I mean, we're just actually in the process of releasing a report on Syrian submunitions, and there's a lot of overlap between submunitions in Syria and submunitions in Ukraine, because it's all sort of Russian and late Soviet. So hopefully that would be something that we could add on, because it's sort of fairly similar. It's a little more complex, to be more classes and categories, but definitely scalable for that for sure.
Hi, thank you. I was just wondering if there are any additional plans to add tags such as manufacturer, origin, etc.
Yes. So the reason why we didn't include manufacturers in the first version is because we were trying to focus on the visual characteristics, and those are manufacturer is not something that you can tell from the visual traits and characteristics of ammunition. So that's why we didn't include it in this first project. But it is our intention to include it in the future, because we find that is very important information in order to understand. So once we have more information on the model, so the tentative model that Nawar is tagging, I think that will help us give more information about manufacture.
We also don't want to get sued.
Hi, my name is Ian Overton. I run Action on Armed Violence, which is a research charity that works with the International Network on Explosive Weapons, INEW, and we have a global explosive violence monitor. So this is both incredibly useful, but leads to two questions. The first is do you think there might be a possibility or an ambition to contextualize, not just about manufacturers because of the suing bit, but maybe to say this weapon has known to have caused, when used in populated areas, X percentage of civilian harm. So to give it some sort of context that then journalists can immediately latch onto and report on that. That's the first question. The second one, which I know is much more complicated, and I'm not asking it naively, but do you think there may be any opportunity because IEDs cause around 50% of global explosive violence harm, do you think there's any opportunity to include IEDs in this?
Charles, I'll leave you with IEDs. Oh, yeah, okay. I'll take the contextualization. Yes. Absolutely. I think it's important to contextualize. I think there's a balance, and I think by linking it to specific civilian harm events, that's one way that we can do it. I'm slightly wary of saying that 40% of people or 80% of people killed by mortars are civilians, because I think those figures are mostly just extrapolations that aren't based on fact, or very, very hard to verify. How do you do that across 12 different countries, etc.? So I'd be a bit wary of that, but yeah, absolutely, that kind of context of what the munitions do is a very important part. And we also, we're trying to put ourselves in a space of Airwars are very focused on, most of these munitions are accurate munitions or precision munitions or not, or etc. We're not trying to kind of campaign on this here. We're not trying to make it a campaign tool. The space has to be that everyone accepts that the information there is trusted and valued. And as soon as I think we take it to claims, then I think we're in a different space. And, it's not necessarily, I think, one that Airwars really goes into, because unless we have absolute data. But yeah, I think generally, yes, contextualization, particularly this munition is generally made in this arsenal, this generally used by this military. There are other people that are doing that already, but that we could try and incorporate that in terms of how this has been noted in this. And I think over time also you will, if we could develop it, you will be able to say, okay, well, this munition, the whatever, let's take a simple one like a grad rocket. a BM21, you will be able to see all of the locations. You'll have a geographic map. At the moment, we don't need that because they're all Ukraine with a few exceptions. But like, you know, that kind of understanding. So like over time, you build a data set without having to make kind of big claims in that sense. Yeah.
And then as far as the IEDs go, I am personally not a huge IED expert. We have people in areas who are, so I could direct the question to them as well. But my sense would be that it would be something that's harder to classify sort of by necessity because of, you know, improvised. But I think it would definitely be a thing that could be cool to put on the site as like, here is, you know, a few examples of IEDs. But again, I think the logistics of that, I'd have to talk to Nick or Tony at Ares and figure it out. Thanks for the question.
Okay, in the interest of time, we have a question from this chap over here, and then a question here. We'll take 2 questions, then we'll go through some of the online questions. Okay.
Thanks so much. Chaim Abraham from UCL Laws. Congratulations, this is fantastic. Again, another question about context. I'm wondering if there's going to be any added context about legality of some munitions or legality of their use generally. Thank you.
Question there.
Hey, Nick Walsh from Bellingcat. I think this looks absolutely amazing. I think the concept is incredible, and I think it's absolutely brilliant what you've done with it as well. My question is kind of linked to a couple of other ones that I've seen come up. Have you considered including information about specific codes seen on weapons? So things like cage codes, serial numbers, etc., manufacture dates, and you know, point them out where they are on the weapon and how they can be identified.
Yeah, we'll do those 2 then.
Should I take it?
The first one, the second.
Okay. I'll take the legality one. You could tell there's a lawyer in the room, right? Yeah. Yes, again, with the caveat that we don't want to get sued. But yeah, no, I mean, yes. So like when you have contextual information, yeah, clearly, like, you know, you can be very factual about that. You can say, you know, cluster munitions have been banned by X number of countries, etc. Like that will be the next stage, definitely. We're obviously, again, we're not lawyers. We're not, we don't have any Airwars as documenters. We don't do kind of, we're not legal experts. And so we wouldn't necessarily go deep into it, but I think it's certainly like where you can say that this has been banned by this country, etc. All of that contextual information is really important. I just don't think, and I'd be interested to follow up if you've got kind of specific things that you think where we should be focusing on that. Yeah. Julie, do you want to take the codes, or Charles?
I can follow up if you want.
Yeah, like particularly why we didn't include codes in this round, and we did consider how we could identify munitions through the markings, and at certain point we were considering whether we would have like some kind of search bar where you could introduce markings, but that required a lot more work on verification and identification, and also like a lot more work in Cyrillic alphabet, which none of our like researchers that were doing this particular tool had enough knowledge of to do properly. So that is something that we are considering in the future to also take markings into consideration. And I don't know if you want to elaborate.
Yeah, I think that about covered it. I mean, obviously, like the classification versus identification, classification is going to be a little bit more straightforward. And, you know, obviously, like if we're doing just like the pure sort of classification tool, it's going to be harder to like, if there's not a visible marking, it's going to be hard to identify from there. But I feel like it's an interesting idea to have, you know, like if once we get like the tentative models up, it's sort of an interesting idea to have like, oh, and here's where you would find the markings, etc. But I don't know. I mean, that would be sort of later down.
Okay, we got a couple of questions from online. We've got Mark Galasco asked whether there's any plans to include information on things like weapon effects or associated with these munitions. And then there's a pair of questions which I think are sort of related. Got Dan New asked about user safety. If there's any kind of user safety guides for people identifying munitions. I did see there was a warning right at the top, but I haven't made perhaps anything further about that. And also Louisa Macmillan has asked how you've thought or approached the idea of misuse of this platform and perhaps safeguarding in terms of the information.
Okay. Remind me what Mark said exactly.
Whether adding the information on weapon effects, blast fragmentation.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you look at on the resources page, we've said we haven't gone into blast fragmentation, and Imogen and I actually originally, that was the idea. We wanted to do that where you'd, but actually it's much more we also didn't really know what we were doing. So the original idea was if you had a crater, you'd build a tool that you could work out if you knew the munition, where it was fired from, and you'd look at angles and that kind of stuff. It didn't quite work, so it's been a learning process. So that's something that we would still like to do at some point, right, Imogen? So the absolutely, all of that qualitative information. So we did put, if you click on our air delivered bombs, we did put, for example, and this is from you guys, what most commonly it remains. Or maybe it's on some of the other ones. But what are the most common fragments that you find? Yes.
Anyway, generally thick walled fragments. Yeah. So artillery guns are like a artillery projectile usually has like very thick fragments.
So like some explanation, but I think there's definitely scope for that to develop over time as well. And like the reason we wanted to have this conversation today is to like have those ideas about what should be the kind of priorities for the tool in the next year, really.
So about the misuse.
Yeah, that was
So I would say that we really try to design a tool that can explain the effects and the impacts of weapons, but it's not a guide to use munitions. Like that's a very different thing. So I mean, in terms of misuse, I think we were having that in mind along the process and thinking that what we're looking at is how munitions are impacting, not how they are being used, like how they are used. So I think that for me makes a bit the difference.
What about misuse in terms of like people submitting things to check and messing things up?
So because the pipeline for verification is first images are uploaded, but they are not directly published. They have to go through verification first. That kind of prevents as well images that might be fake images. Yeah.
Dan's question about user safety.
That's one for you.
Yes, user safety, as someone mentioned, we have this warning at the beginning of the page of not to approach munitions. So that's like our safety approach. And I think it is a question that is related with the question of misuse, right? Like this tool has been designed to look into the effects of weapons, not into the use of weapons.
Yeah, it's important unless you have specialist training. I'm sure everyone here knows don't touch an artillery shell. But I mean, we're happy to, if you want to ask us for like help on various things related to that, we're happy to help out.
And in terms of conflict affected community, and I think you particularly were very keen on us making it available in other languages, and that's partly one of the things that you would want is that, I mean, ideally, at least in an ideal world, that like people would be able to see something but also not approach it, and they would know immediately. We at Airwars have documented many cases of, and everyone else, many other journalists in this room have done, of cluster munitions or and kids coming along and picking up bits of fragment and thinking it's something and then dying. And we've got many cases that Emily could tell you about in our archive, particularly of in Syria, lots and lots of cases of the incidents that occurred 2-3 years even after the strike. And so like we're very conscious of that, we're also very open to any ideas of ways that we could improve the way that we do this.
Okay, I think we have time for one last question. Anyone has one? Yes.
Two.
Oh, two. Oh yeah, two. Okay. You had your hand up and you had, so this person. Yeah, okay.
So just a really quick follow-up on the weapons effects. Mark Latimer from Ceasefire. I'm not sure if you quite answered the question, Joe, because I think you interpreted it as being about what you can see on the ground. But there's another aspect to weapons effects, which I think might be easier to crack, which is that I mean, I'm not the expert, but I know a lot of weapons are published with stuff like the blast radius or even more importantly, the circular error probable. So that's something that goes to the accuracy of the weapon. Obviously the conditions, it depends partly on the conditions, but this stuff, it also goes to the legal use of the tool, because it can help you to understand what a commander could foresee in terms of the whether a potential weapon, whether the use of a weapon was indiscriminate or not.
Yeah, I'll just see if I can share screen. Yeah, so we actually, this is one of the things that we were very insistent on, is
Significantly
that
with
all of
caliber
these
and
4 videos
making them a 3D Raptors at 75
have
meters
a blast
and can
radius.
cause widespread damage
and
to an area.
As you will know, it's actually really difficult to get comparable blast radiuses of different, and you're talking about, and these are generalized. We're talking about mortars in general. We're talking about air delivered bombs in general. We're talking about missiles. That will be easier when you have a very specific munition. You can talk about a blast radius, right? Yeah. And Charles, maybe you want to add in on that, but that was something that we've made sure to add to all 4 of these videos, because we wanted to do that. And if you have ways that you think that we can do that better, I think that's certainly true. It's not primarily designed with thinking of criminal accountability necessarily, but that's certainly a factor that you could account for. Someone, Charles?
Yeah, I mean, I think Joe about covered it. I think because a rocket and missile such a broad category. I think the first steps doing that would be trying to come up with as many tentative models as possible, and then from there looking at the the guides or why am I'm blanking on the term, on the manuals of these munitions and their original. Sorry. Yeah, the brochures, the manuals of the munitions, and then having putting in the technical data there. But I think that would require having the models all published first.
Okay, and one last question. Let's chat down here. Sorry,
I'm not sure who that was.
Sorry.
There.
Hi. Yeah, thanks. I mean, this was really exciting, and hopefully, well done, Joe, and everyone. Hopefully, it's going to save us quite a bit of time chasing, a number of experts on things like that. By the way, I'm Nadia Ibrahim from Christiaan's team from the New York Times. Yeah, so I think this one is for Joe. Joe, is this maybe? Sorry if I've already answered this or highlighted it. Is this new platform integrated with your main Airwars platform?
That's definitely a question for Julia.
So it's an independent platform, but on around 100 images of the repository, they are connected to civilian casualty incidents that are in Airwars archive. So as much as we could, we tried to bring this human dimension to the tool, and little by little, we'll try to see also, for example, which images that we have from Ukraine might cross over with images of our reporting of casualties in our own archive as well.
Because that would be really useful for the current events, and if you can link that to it. I'm sure you're adding.
Yeah, we're trying. We're now in the process of trying to work it so that I don't know. Sorry for side note, but Airwars is trying to track all allegations of civilian harm in Gaza and Israel during this conflict, and doing them as kind of open source reporting. And these are all. There are now 1,000 allegations-ish, that we have tracked, of which only around 40 have been published, because they go through a 5 or 6 stage review process and multiple languages assessments. But where there's also, we're now trying to develop a system that when the researcher that is doing that in the primary language sees an image that they think is useful for the tool, they do a tag, and then it's gets added to, and so that like it then comes up, it appears on my screen and tells me that there's been a tag, and then I can then put it into, they're two separate CMSs, etc. But like that I can then immediately link it to that civilian harm incident.
I hope you're expanding because it's going to take a lot of work. So.
Yeah. Feel free to throw some money at it.
Okay, well, it's been a fantastic panel and a fantastic tool for everyone to use. It's live as of 4 p.m. today. So without further ado, I welcome you to give a round of applause to Airwars and Airwars. There are drinks available at the back.
Stop this recording.
Yeah.